Paul and his wife were inseparable until 5 years ago, death took his beloved. Those years passed like a fog for him. They were dreary and monotonous, without a single ray of light. The man had lived alone for a long time. His only son had grown up, found a good job, and now had a family of his own. Then he went to live in another city, and communication between father and son slowly faded away. The son sometimes even forgot to wish his father a happy birthday, not to mention simply calling to ask how he was doing. Paul was not needed by his son, and he understood this long ago. Sadness and loneliness filled his every day. And so, another winter came and people around him were getting ready for Christmas. Paul had no one to celebrate it with, and when he thought about it, he almost cried. On Christmas Eve, the man decided to get out of the house for a walk in the fresh air. It was snowing in soft flakes, and people were bustling about their business, finishing the last preparations. Paul watched them and remembered how he and his wife were also preparing for the holiday. He did not notice how he reached the station, where he bought a ticket to the village where he and his wife had a house near the forest. In order to pay for their son's education and his successful future, they sold this house, where they had spent many happy years. When he reached the familiar station, the man stepped out of the carriage and, breathing in the fresh air, walked down the familiar street. Passing by the farm shop, Paul said hello to the owner. She had worked here for many years and of course remembered Paul and his wife. She asked the man how he was doing and where his wife was. Paul sadly answered that she had been gone for 5 years ago. The shopkeeper was very upset and surprised. What was he doing here, after all they had sold the house a long time ago? As if reading this silent question in her eyes, Paul added that he was going to spend Christmas on the grave of his wife, who was buried here at her request. The woman was struck by the sorrow in the man's voice and only sympathetically advised him not to stay long, because it was going to be a snowy and cold night. The man said goodbye and walked on confidently. Upon arriving at the cemetery and finding his wife's grave, Paul looked fondly at her picture and said he had come to celebrate the holiday with her. Then he sighed and began to remember the best moments of their life together. 2 hours had passed, and he was still sitting near the grave, and mentally asked his wife to take him with her. When Paul looked at his wife's photo on the tombstone, it seemed to him as if she understood him, but at the same time, she would send him away. But Paul was so reluctant to go home where no one was waiting for him, that he wasn't even concerned about the frost and snow. Near his wife, whom he loved, everything seemed warmer and cozier. Suddenly, there were footsteps behind him. For the first seconds, Paul was frightened, because who would want to come here on such a night? But then he heard the familiar voice of his former neighbor Helen. She smiled amiably and said that her husband was also buried here. She went to his grave, stood for a while, and then returned to Paul. She looked at the man and said the grocery store owner had told her he was here. A little embarrassed, she added that the living had no place in a cemetery at night, much less on a holiday, and then invited Paul to her house for a holiday pie. Helen also lived alone. They talked all night, remembering the past. Paul even began to smile. He felt calm and peaceful again, something he hadn't felt for several years. In the morning, the man thanked Helen for her hospitality and got ready to leave. He preferred not to bother her, but the woman asked him to stay. At lunchtime, her daughter and her family arrived, who were very friendly and warm to Paul, and Helen suggested that Paul spend the holidays with them. He really didn't mind staying in the warm family atmosphere. The man felt like he was home again. So one day turned into years of living together. Helen and Paul decided to spend the rest of their lives with each other. Who knows, maybe it was the late spouses who helped bring Paul and Helen's lives together so that no one would be lonely.